Hey folks, Max here. And no, officer, he was bending over to tie his shoes and I tripped and fell right in. I make videos about the intersection of sex, kink, and politics, and this video is very on brand as we were discussing the history of cruising. Asterisks, but not bathhouses, as I already have a video out there on that. Consider checking it out later, and if you like this type of content, subscribe. I also think it's important to mention that this will focus on gay men because I'm a gay adjacent man, and I feel like it would be really weird if I was alone doing a video on lesbians. But I do want to do a video on that later with one or more of my friends. Well, first things first, what is cruising? Well, if you were thinking boats, then you're technically correct, the best kind of correct, and we'll get to that. But cruising typically refers of the activity of going around public places looking for someone to have sex with, walking around or driving about a locality called a cruising ground in search of a sexual partner, usually of the anonymous, casual, one-time variety. But this definition leaves a lot unsaid. Perhaps it's just a look, an acknowledgement that at the right time, at the right place, that you and them could do unspeakable things to each other. Well, unspeakable until brunch. But other times, cruising can be an otherworldly experience. The looks, the signals, the circling, nonverbal communication, etc. It's hard to define, especially if you've never done it before. And not to gatekeep gaslight girl boss you, but I wouldn't necessarily consider perusing the apps to be comparable. It's the difference of walking down a strip of restaurants, looking at the storefronts, and smelling the smells until one draws you in, versus looking for delivery on Grubhub. Both give you the same result, but one is an experience, which is not always a good thing, so I'm not promoting this behavior. Not at all. But if you were to take part in this activity, in a video game, of course, like Minecraft, while it can be fun, cruising comes with a risk, not only from cops, I mean creepers, the people you invite in your crevices or on your diamond sword. So exercise caution, put your diamonds in a chest before leaving home, and don't get griefed. How do I cruise? The anatomy of cruising. While I'll tend to talk about parks, bathrooms, theaters, video arcades, bars, and more, make no mistake, cruising can and does happen everywhere, as cruising happens wherever two queer folk can lay eyes upon another. If you ever made bedroom eyes at a person of the gender or genders you're attracted to, congratulations, you're cruising. Although inevitably, when you tell people that, they want to know how to seal the deal, though the act of cruising isn't necessarily about that. And Delany's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, when discussing his experiences in the theaters that used to grace 42nd Street, he describes a number of men. Despite these men are all in the theater looking for release, they aren't all cruising. Now, Delany doesn't spend much time on defining what cruising means to him, but as I read through, one story stuck out to help me solidify my definition. It's a story about a straight man that comes to the theater to whack it to the movies, and as long as other men are at least one seat away, they can watch. I would consider this sex, as it is mutual masturbation. Sure, we can get into politics of penetrative sex, but that's not the point here. The point is that this man is not cruising. Other men are cruising him, but he himself is not cruising despite having sex. He's not looking at these men, nor is he truly interacting in any verbal or non-verbal way before or during his process of getting off. In fact, it doesn't seem like he even took into account how many people were watching him until after his climax, or he doesn't understand why they would. As he says, I'm getting off to her up there, and you guys are all getting off on me? He's truly only there for the movie, and because he's related to the owner, so he can get in for free. It doesn't matter to him if the theater was empty or not. Cruisers, on the other hand, like the men interacting with him, are there for the sole purpose of connection with another man. Whether it's watching another guy or two or more, participating in the play yourself, or otherwise. To put it in a different way, I'll hark back to the term I coined in my previous video, cruising profiles. The modes and motivations of cruisers. You need one to cruise. This man lacks a cruising profile since he lacks motivation to play with other men. Additionally, I'll bring up another term from the same video, the cyclical nature of cruising. Round and round, cruising spots tend to have a loop-like structure to them, in order to facilitate the flow of space. as there tend to be people that post up and stay at a single or several spots at the bar, remaining stationary once they are placed, while there are others who take laps around the loop to look at the men who are posted up. From there, the Madden play-by-play looks something like this. Well, now you see, a man initiates eye contact. If that eye contact is reciprocated, then we can start looking at welcoming signs. A smile, a wink, just something flirty enough to draw the man in. After that, talking may or may not ensue, and if all is well, maybe some kissing, and then more. This process can stop or take a number of detours, but that's the gist of things. Back to you, Max. Why do gay people cruise? If someone is not asking the how of cruising, they're typically asking the why of cruising. In the present day, in the US, there are many reasons to do it. You prefer meeting people this way, it's fun, you're bored, you saw a hot guy go that way, etc. But historically, as I will cover, sodomy was illegal, which meant no matter where you had gay sex, it was illegal. Thus, if you were seen entering a hotel room with a man or bringing another man back to your place, your neighbors or reception or someone with your name could and possibly would turn you in. Therefore, going to some remote place where there will be mostly men looking to have sex with other men, none of which likely know each other's names, was the safest you could get at the time. Though some viewers may come away with the assumption that there is no real reason to do it now, they may go on to think that sodomy is legal and people are using history as an excuse to get quick sex, and not, quote-unquote, work for it like in a heterosexual relationship. Real comment I've gotten. No joke. I think Delany sums it up perfectly. A glib wisdom holds that people like this don't want relationships. They have problems with intimacy, but the salient fact is, these were relationships. Beginnings of cruising. Typically, the topics we cover have existed since prehistory, but cruising is an interesting one. Because yes, men eyeing each other and having sex has been a thing for a very long time, but a lot of implicit parts to cruising, like secrecy, evasion of the law, etc., weren't. In fact, those implicit parts of cruising wouldn't become a factor until the rise of purity culture brought on in the West by Christianity. Which, why yes, I have a video on. It's almost like I planned these things. But here are the Spark Notes TM. Starting in the 1200s, the Roman Catholic Church was not too hot on gay men. Actually, no, they were very hot on them, as in they thought that all queer men were going to hell. Because sex between women isn't sex because where's the penis? Clearly they've never experienced girl cock, but I digress. This line of thought continued for centuries until almost every European country criminalized sodomy. Unfortunately, those are the countries that colonized almost the entirety of the rest of the world. So, after their influence, the rest of the world also ain't looking so hot. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Looking to 1492, we see the beginning of the purge against the vice of sodomy, which is my new album name. Come listen to us perform songs like Symbol Completion live in Sin City. But that brings us to the gap in time that I left in the Bathhouses video. We love a gaping hole. In time. And it's even better when they're filled. The first targets of the purge were places used for homosexual acts, like taverns, bathhouses, casini, which were like sex casinos? Casexos?
No.
But bathrooms, parks, and other clandestine locations? Fair game. Well, you would still be convicted if you were caught, but they were safer places to get dicked down 5 different ways until Sunday, which then you would go to mass and repent, I guess. But Italy wasn't the only holy country without an O. CEO of Healthy Relationships, Henry VIII, enacted the Buggery Act of 1533, which banned sodomy until 1861, in jolly old England. But just like the Italians, the Brits weren't having none of it. God, that was bad. In it. And they too were fucking in parks, fields, and bathrooms. Some things really don't change. Unfortunately, many people were caught, executed, tortured, and imprisoned during this time. But in the late 1700s, things were starting to look up. Well, for certain countries. At least, kinda. In 1791, after the French video game The Rich, the new, based France adopted a new penal code that decreed you could not be put in the penal zone for touching the penal area. Same for similarly based Haiti, which at the time was called Saint Dominique, since this was before they reached optimum basedness. Though, when they video gamed their masters, they didn't reintroduce anti-sodomy laws. Also Andorra, but they're smaller, so who cares. In that last decade of the 1700s, in no particular order, Luxembourg, Belgium, Monaco, Switzerland, and more all legalized gay. This doesn't mean that homophobia was over in these areas. Many gay folks in these regions would continue to maintain that air of secrecy, passing word about cruising locations carefully through word of mouth. But the state-sanctioned executions were a thing of the past, at least for these countries. Though that didn't stop them from doing other horrible things like chemical castration. R.I.P. my man Alan Turing. World's first recorded cruising ground raid. But talking about state-sanctioned executions, wow, that's a rather grim segue. But the earliest cruising spot raid was the Vere Street coterie arrest in 1810. The story goes that there was a raid on a Vere Street Molly house, which is just a general British term for meeting place for gay men. I suppose our cultural equivalent would be a Charlie XCX concert. Lady Gaga? Taylor Swift? Okay, I don't know what you like. 6 men were arrested, and 2 men that, get this, weren't even there during the raid, were executed. And homosexuality wasn't even made double illegal yet. That wouldn't be until 1885, where Henry Labouchere had to tie up some loose ends. He was really like, hey, I know we're already arresting and executing them, but like, what if more? On a happier note, the YMCA, your great-grandfather's favorite cruising ground, was founded in the UK in 1844. I talked about them more in the History of Bathhouses video, but I had to give a nod back to them. Too long, well, who am I kidding? You've probably never said that in your life. Too long didn't read. The YMCA came to the US in 1851, and it gave queer men at the time another spot to cruise. That, depending on how cool the staff was much safer than the outdoor areas we all knew and loved. But with the introduction of the YMCA, the onset of bathhouses was just right around the corner. So what did our cruisers of various parks, bathrooms, video arcades, adult bookstores, theaters, alleyways, okay, I think you get it. What did they do? Quite like our present, bathhouses exist, but people cruise in many other ways. Not everyone took to the bathhouses for many different reasons, be it cost, safety concerns, or discrimination. The introduction of gay camping. So there were folks that stayed in their parks, bookstores, bathrooms, and forests, but some delved deeper into the woods. Like, all the way. With a tent. Talk about camp! Yes, with the entrance into the 20th century, no longer was camping just a thing that rich white men do. Now, mostly white men of all classes could have their Brokeback Mountain moment, thanks to the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a public jobs program that came out of the New Deal from 1933 to 1942 that helped young, unemployed, unmarried men, including drag queens. The CCC was a direct response for those people who were in need of work after being unable to find work during the Great Depression. In their leisure time, they worked out, I mean, there was a lot of stretching involved, and did theater. Seriously. There is no heterosexual explanation for this. When I was researching this, it reminded me of many of the fun moments I had at various gay camps in the US, except with hard labor as a backdrop. Then the US involvement in World War II happened, the CCC was disbanded, and a lot of these people came back with leather fetishes. Side note, I really do wonder if the CCC to Leather Daddy pipeline is the reason that many leather clubs have their runs at camps to this very day. An aside about Tina. I'm about to have my Pepe Salvia moment, so I should probably dress accordingly. Category is Gay Bear Charlie Day. I have compiled a lot of pieces of history that led me to an interesting theory. As I said, the CCC was disbanded, so many of them could be drafted to fight in the US involvement of World War II. World War II is connected with the leather fetish for a variety of reasons, from biker gangs, as once upon a time, leather clubs were referred to as MCs, which could be motorcycle club or men's club, to Hugo Boss. And that's all I'm saying there.
I mean, they do love leather, don't they, the Germans? I mean, every bit of it is, it's just leather, leather, leather.
Shortly before the war, in the early 1930s, there was a drug called Benzedrine that was starting to be sold in pharmacies across the US. Benzedrine has another much more popular name. This drug became even more popularized during World War II as the Axis and Allies alike used it. Well, technically the Axis had a drug called Pervitin, which was still meth, but with an added methyl group, so it passed the blood-brain barrier quicker. So, kind of worse, actually. Although the use of Benzedrine didn't stop after the war. In fact, no, it was quite the opposite. From depression to dieting, Benzedrine was America's new cure-all superdrug. The leading companies, SKF and Clark & Clark, produced an estimated 13 million to 55 million tablets per month.
Which was the style at the time?
The recommended dose for the average person was 2 tablets, which could have been 5 milligrams to 10 milligrams a tablet, which was actually showing some restraint, considering during the war, some soldiers took upwards of 20 milligrams per battle. It's important to note that these 20 milligrams weren't couched in a slow-release coating like many of today's drugs, so you would get hit with the full force of 20 milligrams all at once. Considering the effect that this had on meth use in the US as a whole, I wonder if that's the reason today why the gay community still has such a problem with Tina. The history of Hanky Code. MCs led to an explosion of gay bars in the 50s throughout the 70s, especially lever and cruise bars in the US, but that's another video for another time. What I wanted to focus on was some main symbols of cruising, as many modern symbols appeared around this time. You have keys worn on the left to indicate topping, on the right for bottoming, and same with earrings. Yes, folks, both sides are the gay side. But most notably, we have the Hanky Code. The true origin of the Hanky Code is widely disputed. Some attribute it to a Village Voice article from 1970, where a journalist joked that it would be more efficient and subtle to announce their particular sexual focus by wearing different colored handkerchiefs. Which, I mean, he had a point, while others attribute it to the Trading Post in 1971 or the founder of Mr. S. Lever in 1972. But there were other color codes emerging at the same time, like the punk lace code in London, or codes that had existed for over a century at that point, like the square dancing hanky code. Regardless of the origin, there are certain colors that typically remain the same. Black for S&M, medium blue for fucking, light blue for oral, red for fisting, gray for bondage, yellow for piss, so creative, pink for dildos, hunter green for daddies and boys, and orange for anything, anytime, anywhere. I do say typically because sometimes even those differ, like in the lesbian hanky code that was first published in On Our Backs in 1984, though I don't believe this is used anymore. In the present day, there are many expanded codes that add awesome things like flagging rope for suspension or black and white checkered for safe sex, and then there are less cool things like racialized hanky code. Although, in the 70s, hanky code was a useful marker to see A, who was gay, and B, if you shared the same kinks. Now, for the most part, hanky code isn't really used. There are flagging nights at certain bars, and lever folks sometimes show their colors at various kink nights, whether it is a part of their gear or in their back pocket. Personally, I flag for fun, fashion, and as a conversational starter. Although you should never assume because someone is flagging something that it means they want to do it right now or with you. Always get an explicit, enthusiastic yes before playing with others. The Tearoom, Cottaging, and other cruising spot raids. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, I have to mention the Tearoom. No, not that kind of Tearoom, though there were plenty of white doilies. The Tearoom was a film, but it was not made for general audiences. It was a police feed that captured sexual acts between men in 1962 in Mansfield, Ohio, in order to have evidence to jail them for at least a year based on Ohio sodomy laws at the time. And if you're a fan of esoteric gay video games, you might have played or seen someone play The Tearoom by Robert Yang, which is a commentary on the parallels of policing sexuality then and now. The methods change from staking out locations to entrapment, but in the UK alone, it's estimated that about 100,000 men were arrested for consensual gay intercourse in the 128 years from 1885 to 2013. And the arrests and discrimination haven't stopped, not in the UK or the US. One could say, but Max, they shouldn't have messed around in the public. What if someone who didn't consent saw them? But the men in these scenarios were attempting to be quite private. In the footage of the Tearoom, you can see that one or both of the men look over their shoulders, looking out for the split second that door may open, so they can zip back up. While it can't be displayed visually, the initial trepidation of the encounter, the thoughts that might run through your head as you're trying to decide if the man you want to play with is one of us or a cop. As Yang himself puts in his retrospective of his game Tearoom, is a public bathroom 100% totally public space? If you're being honest, then no. It's not exactly a public plaza or sidewalk, Bathrooms also have enclosures and stalls and the expectation of privacy. They are a sort of public-private space. And he's exactly right. They aren't in the open. That's why Mansfield Police Department needed this kind of evidence in the first place. As if it was so easy to spot these men in the act, then it would have been simple to arrest them, and they would never have to go for the trouble of setting up surveillance at a time where such a thing was mostly unheard of. Did you know that George Michael, yes, that George Michael, was entrapped by a police officer in a Beverly Hills public restroom, before he was out no less, which made him come out publicly, and subsequently he made a song/music video about it called Outside. Then said cop attempted to sue him for $10 million for making him look gay. Thankfully, the court ruled the reason for suing as bullshit. Pretty sure that's the legal term. Cruising in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. But that being said, let's head back to the 70s. Many bathhouses, large events, and sex clubs were in full bloom the world over. We're seeing the most sexual venues, Easter in Berlin in 1975 to IML in 1979, and sexual freedom for many people of many sexualities. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in the 80s once more, which means we are at the AIDS pandemic. Just like we saw with this newest pandemic, no matter the circumstances, people will find a way to bump uglies. Hell, some of them even went on the first gay cruise in 1987, the SS Bermuda Star, because some things never change. Though it is important to know, other than the joke setup of which I could not ignore, we should not shame those who sought out physical connection in these times. While some people did seek out HIV or AIDS with the purpose of being infected, either as a self-destructive behavior or as a fetish, we'll circle back to that, most folks weren't like, LOL, guess I'll go die. Many people were exploring genuine connections that they were making at the time. Maybe they misplaced some trust in someone. They were down on their luck, a condom failed, or was tampered with. No matter the circumstance, no one deserves AIDS or monkeypox or any disease, except for Ronald Reagan, but that white devil has already been taken care of. However, since bathhouses and other sexual businesses were forced to close in cities like New York, Minneapolis, San Francisco, etc., cruising spots saw more traffic. But unlike bathhouses, certain cruising spots were not made for sex. Hell, most park bathrooms aren't even fit for going to the bathroom, much less your local public gangbang. While the bathhouses that were able to remain open could modernize, provide free condoms, add posters outlining risk reduction techniques, and host risk reduction events like jerk-off nights. You wouldn't see that in the truck bed of your dad's hot friend. Though many larger institutions like theaters and bars had similar benefits to bathhouses. Unfortunately, with many of those closing around the same time, it would become harder to leverage the word-of-mouth based education that was prevalent in these spaces. Though there's one side I don't often mention when we talk about HIV/AIDS, and that's bug chasers and gift givers. Bug chasers are those looking for HIV positive loads, while gift givers are the men that give the gift that keeps on coming. I'm not here to comment on the ethics or morality of this kink, but I think it's important to mention that in the present day, for many bug chasers, this is pure fantasy. Many of them are on PrEP and or only have sex with undetectable men. However, there was a time where this was not the case, as seen in the 2003 documentary, The Gift. While I do think a lot of the messaging in this movie was outdated fear-mongering even at the time of release, it does take place in an interesting time. At this time, being undetectable wasn't really a thing. March 30th, 2000 is the earliest known study researching reduced viral loads, and it wouldn't be until 2011 that HPTN 052 would prove that HIV treatment is prevention. Thus, undetectable is untransmittable. Honestly, I could make a whole video on this movie alone, but the short of it is that there's a lot of shaming of men who choose to bareback. Sue me, it feels better. Condoms or monogamy is greatly preferred in the framing of this movie and is seen as peak morality, even though there are men who admit that HIV is no longer a death sentence in 2003. Which at the time, they would be right, as this was a turning point in many ways for many people. Their testimony was contrasted by those talking about who have died around them. Does that make one side a truth and the other side a lie? I believe the people who have lost are telling their truths, and the people who bareback every day and are fine are telling their truth. Their accounts are two sides of a community that suffered a massive trauma, and they are all just individual people trying to do what they think is best for them. Considering the COVID-19 pandemic, all of the folks that can watch these videos have likely had to make similar choices. How HIV and gentrification changed the cruising landscape. Later in the 90s, things were starting to look up. HIV and AIDS treatments were becoming more effective and accessible, but the landscape that had been cultivated for over a century had been decimated in just one decade, and all in the name of safety. Bathhouses would never return to some cities. Cruising grounds were leveled or deforested, and many men who were familiar faces were now just names in the paper's obituary section. Many people in the comments of my bathhouses video were quick to admit how dangerous, how seedy, how awful these places are and were. Some of these folks were queer themselves and called me nostalgic, for slammed me for glorifying the past. As I was reading Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, I happened upon Delany addressing that very same critique. Often seen at best, nostalgia for an outmoded past, and at worst, a pernicious glorification of everything dangerous. Unsafe sex, neighborhoods filled with undesirables breed unsafe characters, promiscuity, an attack on the family and the stable social structure, and dangerous, non-committed, unsafe relationships. This is not to say you cannot criticize certain points about cruising. I certainly do my fair share of that. Though, be careful about how you choose your words, as critiques that uphold chaste monogamy as a moral high ground cede to the arguments of the very people that would consider you as part of the undesirables. And once you are seen as an undesirable, you will be demonized today as you demonized those yesterday. What I initially found interesting about Times Square Red, Times Square Blue was despite taking place over the 80s, AIDS is not a focus of the work. Delany mentions it, but it seems that the displacement, the transformation of the space, is more deadly. Albeit, this is treating these issues as far too separate. As in New York City, as well as various other American cities that I've mentioned, the ability to paint cities with the broad stroke of being overrun with AIDS was the very thing that allowed well-meaning property developers to come in. Did I say well-meaning? I meant money-grubbing. It was easier than ever before to demonize dirty businesses. And with driving those businesses away, they drove away undesirable people. And driving away undesirable people, they were able to erect large luxury apartments, forever trapping us in this positive feedback loop of luxury development. Albeit not as much as our hellish present, property costs have skyrocketed as the loop has cycled on, but there was land elsewhere that could be repurposed. This brings us back to the gay campground. Based on different campground websites, many gay campgrounds that were still running today at least were founded in the 90s or early 2000s, including Jones Pond, my alma mater that I graduated summa cum laude from. Hillside, The Woods, Camp It, and Camp Buckwood, just to name a few. Campgrounds host everything from drag shows, lever runs, bear runs, and many other themed events that bring people near and far together. And if you want to visit one near you, I will link some articles and a playlist about some of the campgrounds across North America. But don't be dismayed if you don't see your state or country in those links. There are queer groups that have camps or other spaces that aren't always queer or perhaps are private that they rent out for their runs, so you may just have to do a little asking around. Another important development of the early 2000s, other than the twink whose ass you ate last night, was Loris versus Texas, which has been back in the news when I first wrote this. But we'll circle back around to that. Thanks to the prenumbral right of privacy, previously guaranteed by the First Amendment, according to Griswold versus Connecticut, RIP, sodomy was no longer punishable by law, though several states got on the decriminalization train as early as about 40 years prior. Gay cruising in the present day. But that brings us to the present. In our modern day, cruising still happens everywhere from the dance floor to the forest floor. But there's something else that is still happening everywhere. Gentrification. Despite what I said in the beginning, we have little cruising machines on our desktops and maybe even in your hands at this very moment. Starting with a site called Gaydar in 1999, to chat rooms, to Craigslist, to Scruff, to Grindr, and more, today finding hookups online has never become easier and more normal. But Max, you just mentioned gentrification. What does that have to do with gay cruising apps? Many people have cited apps' negative effects on cruising spaces, going as far to say that they're responsible for the dip in cruising populations, as well as cruising bars, bathhouses, and other such establishments. This is not only ignoring apps that advertise active cruising grounds, but also the continued effects of gentrification on our urban landscape. Though apps aren't entirely innocent. They may not be culpable for the destruction of your local cum-based watering hole, but at the same time, they don't create the same connections as it either. While, yes, I hinted at this in the beginning, it's more insidious than just my cute little jokes. In the midst of a world losing physical spaces to connect, we become increasingly socially atomized. You may argue that the internet would alleviate these concerns as now people across the world can be connected instantly. Right? Right? But I have to remind you that we're talking about gay dating apps here. Atomization is in their code. Need I remind you of the race filters that basically every gay dating app had? They no longer exist, as people pointed out the obvious racism of sorting out black people or any non-white person, or fetishizing non-white people, not because they weren't used. As anyone who has used these apps could tell you that many ways that no fats, no femmes, no blacks can be written. Physical space encourages what Delany calls interclass contact. That is not to say that your local bar can't be racist, touche, nor is this to say that there aren't historical cruising grounds that were segregated. But you can't go to a space in real life and filter out black people from existence. Sure, this doesn't affect your all-white friend group, or any of your racist preferences, but you have to engage with black people existing. Something that the apps allowed users to skirt for years before finally removing them. Gay cruising on the internet. Is cybering cruising? I've started playing Final Fantasy XIV again, and it reminded me of an entirely separate part of online cruising. ERP, or erotic role-playing. You've probably heard it referred to as cybering. I've been engaging in some kind of ERP from my days back on Second Life. Allegedly. Don't investigate how old I was. I feel that the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV, which has a free trial including the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning expansion Heavensward up to level 60 with no restrictions on playtime. Actually, wait, I think that's the old version of the copy pasta. I digress. Final Fantasy XIV gives an incredibly powerful avenue for cruising as video games go. Up there with VR chat, as they have a critical feature of cruising baked into them, and that's the look. In VR chat, you can just turn your head, but in Final Fantasy XIV, if you target someone, your character looks at them. In addition to all the customization options like glams that allow you to showcase how big of a slut you are, to your adventurer profile that allows you to showcase how big of a slut you are, there are many towns that are nearly constantly populated from Limsa Lominsa to Ul'dah, and you can apply the same classical techniques. RP walk and take a look at a hot Hrothgar or a Rogadin by clicking on them. There are even mods that tell you who is looking at you at the given time. Honestly, looking at your target is 20% of the reason this is in the video. The other 80% is that I need you to look at my glams. Roe v. Wade, Lawrence v. Texas, Project 2025, and you. And as promised, let's talk about the decision to strike down Roe v. Wade. Can you believe this script is so old that it started before this was even a thing, and now it's old news? Wild. Anywho, the majority opinion, of which was to dissolve Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, 1992, alludes to the prenumbal right to privacy, as in the Roe case, they specifically use the 14th Amendment's right to liberty as a right to privacy. The right to privacy is supported by several other amendments as well, but we're not going to get into those. The majority states that nothing in this opinion should be understood to cast doubts on precedents that do not concern abortion. However, A, they mentioned that they were not going to touch Roe before, and look where we are now.
One of the important things to keep in mind about Roe v. Wade is that it has been reaffirmed many times over the past 45 years.
As Richard Fallon from Harvard said, Roe is not a super precedent because calls for its overruling have never ceased, but that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled.
And B, gay sex is also not necessarily deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, and complicit in the concept of ordered liberty. And C, in Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion, he mentions Lawrence versus Texas by name. Yes, they can all submit these opinions separately, and only have to sign on to the majority, but can you blame me for being cautious here? Furthermore, the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 also makes some interesting claims about the LGBTQ community. They're quick to say that they won't end marriage equality, although they are just as quick to say that married men and women are the ideal natural family structure, and families comprised of a married mother, father, and their children are the foundation of a well-ordered nation and a healthy society. Unfortunately, family policies and programs under President Biden's Unfortunately, family policies and programs under President Biden's HHS are fraught with agenda items focusing on LGBTQ equality and my personal favorite, for the sake of child well-being, programs that should affirm that children require and deserve both the love and nurturing of a mother and the play and protection of a father. Basically saying that a child's well-being would be in danger if their parents were gay. Therefore, if they get their way with trans people, they'll likely push this topic next. So what would that mean for us? Sodomy is codified in the following states. If Lawrence falls, ideally the ACLU would do the same work that they've been doing after Roe, which is pushing court cases and attempting to influence state legislators to codify abortion. Otherwise, this is a grim thing to think about. We could start seeing police raids en masse yet again. Seeking sex on apps could become even more dangerous than it already is, as it could come with jail time. It's not a fun thing to think about, and honestly, it's a bit of a bummer to end on, but we don't have to catastrophize at the moment. The writing may be very well on the wall. However, we can paint right over it. Remember to like, subscribe, and ring bell. As always, my links are down in the description. I hope you have a great rest of your day or whenever you are watching this. Okay, bye!